Great. Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce, for the second time in 24 hours, David Stringer. So Professor Stringer has come to us from Indiana, University of Indiana, and he is, he's originally from Newcastle, and did his undergraduate degree in Manchester, and then has worked in various countries, did his PhD in Durham, and is a linguist by trade, but recently has become interested in sort of biocultural diversity and the links between language and nature. And this is the second talk that he's going to be giving today, or sorry, this, on his visit. Yeah. And yeah, I'm delighted to introduce Folkbiology and the Mental Lexicon, the cultural classification of living kinds.
Well, thank you for another very kind introduction. So this talk today, the talk yesterday was based on a paper that I'm currently writing. Today I'm giving a talk on a paper which came out earlier this year, actually. The year listed here is 2024, but it actually came out in January. You know how journals do that sometimes. So today's talk is about how traditional ecological knowledge is encoded in language. And also it's about the debate between universals and relativism, both in linguistics and in biology, in folk biology. So I always feel the need at the beginning of these talks to really go back to basics, really, because in this kind of interdisciplinary work, none of us knows everything. Some people know more about biology, some people know more about sociology, some people know more about linguistics. So forgive me if I start out in a quite introductory fashion. So if you're interested in biodiversity conservation and you do ethnobiology, then why would you care about linguistics? What's linguistics got to do with any of that? Well, the thing is, people often assume that if you have a name in one language, for example, a plant, and a name in another language, then those two names mean the same thing. But that's because people often equate meaning with reference. They think the meaning of a word is the thing that it denotes in the world. But that's not quite true, as we'll see. So for those of you who were here yesterday, there's a little bit of overlap, so forgive me if you're hearing this again. So Shakespeare famously wrote, for Juliet, as she's on the balcony, what's in a name that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. And this is true in the sense that the name doesn't affect our perception of the smell, our perception of the prickliness of the thorns, for example, or the shape of the flower. Whether you say rosa in Italian or meigui in Mandarin or gul in Turkish, there's an arbitrariness to the way phonology is mapped onto meaning here. A rose is a rose is a rose in one sense, right? But there's an important distinction between sense and reference. In fact, the name of a flower, for example, in one language, almost never means the same as the name for the same flower in another language. And we can illustrate this by looking at English dialect names for flowers. So if you look at foxgloves, the name foxglove comes from folksglove, folk meaning fairy folk. In different parts of England, this is referred to as folksglove, witch's glove, fairy fingers, fairy weed, witch's thimble, flapperdock, dead men's bells. And so obviously in the sense that was being mulled over by Shakespeare, you're pointing to the same flower and the name shouldn't matter. But in fact, the name does matter because fairy fingers or fairy weed refers to the healing properties of the plant, whereas dead men's bells refers to the fact that the plant is toxic and it can kill you. And flapperdock refers to the fact that little children like to go and pop them, right? So there is a difference between sense and reference. Reference is meaning in terms of the denotation of a word, the pointing to an external reference, but sense, the sense of a word, is its meaning in relation to other lexical items in the same mental system, as it were. Here is the picture I showed yesterday of, this is a hike I went on with my family a few years ago. Both these photographs are taken from the same point of the mountain on Ullocks Pike in the Lake District. So Bassenthwaite to the north and Derwentwater to the south. And in the summer, the hills are filled with foxgloves. And foxgloves have been used as a traditional medicine in England, probably for thousands of years. They first appear in a herbal in the 1500s. Now, if Juliet had walked out of her play and gone wandering in the mountains of the Philippines, she could have been disabused quite quickly of the notion that a rose is a rose and a rose, and the names always mean the same thing. So the name for orchids in Ilongot is Lampung, and Lampung means literally the spirits of high places. This is the generic name for orchids, but there are lots of different types of orchids in the world, as you probably know, and there's lots of different orchids also in this part of the Philippines. But the names for the different species of orchids literally translate as their thighs, their fingernails, their braids, their thumbs, their fingers. And there's a particular healing cure, a steaming cure, where what you do is you take different species of orchid and you reassemble the body of the spirit of high places. You put the arms and the legs and the fingers and the braids together, and then there's a steaming cure, and then the spirit of high places enters the body of the person being healed and makes them whole again. So, you know, an orchid by any other name obviously would not be part of the same cultural world at all, right? So there's a sense in which linguistic relativity is really meaningful in these sorts of contexts. Here's a picture of just 3 of the many types of orchids that the Ilongot use in their steaming cures, just because, like, it's nice to not just look at text for an hour, and these flowers are extremely beautiful, right? So there's a lot. What this paper is really about is universals versus relativity, really, in these 2 domains, in language and in biology. There's a long-standing tension, as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know, between research on cognitive universals and lexical and cultural relativity. And I'm going to argue that it's kind of a false dichotomy, right? We really do not have to be trapped in this dichotomy. I'm going to present a range of examples from indigenous taxonomies that provide, you know, words as windows, in a way, onto local ecology and belief systems. And I'm going to argue that universalist and relativist perspectives are not in conflict, and the indigenous naming systems are very important. They're of comparable social and scientific value to Western taxonomies. So let's look at language first, and briefly. So I do believe in linguistic universals, actually, you know, especially in syntax and phonology, although I do believe in a form of extreme lexical relativity. But in syntax, for example, there are so many examples of completely unrelated languages that exhibit the same syntax, even though they've never been in contact. There's no historical connection between the languages, and they live in completely different natural environments. So, for example, there's a phenomenon in linguistics called V2, where the finite verb has to be in second position. We have this in English as a relic of the system that used to dominate the language. We have it with negative adverbials, for example. So we say things like, under no circumstances would I see that film again, or like, no way did she kiss him last night, or something like this. As long as it's a negative adverbial, whatever the finite verb is will move into second position. But in a language like German or Dutch or Swedish, you do that in every single main clause. Like every single sentence, the finite, you know, this room came I into yesterday, right? This is the way you speak. So you might think, well, maybe, is it because, like, Dutch is related to German? Maybe there's something there. Maybe it's because they live in a flat landscape. Maybe they have dikes, you know, flatlands. Maybe there's lots of reeds in the country. I mean, there's no way you can tie V2 to the flatlands of Holland, because you also find V2 in the mountains of Kashmir, right, in completely unrelated languages. You have serial verb constructions in Upper Amazonia, in the Kalahari Desert, and in Beijing. In phonology, you have geminate consonants, or paired consonants, like kappa, or pizza, or something like that. You have them in Italy, you have them in Japan. It's not because of ancient contact between Italy or Japan, or because of, you know, they eat the same kind of fish or something. There are linguistic universals that they keep bubbling up in one language after another. because it's part of our human language faculty to be able to construct languages in these ways. People have tried to tie tone languages to environment, but there's extremely convincing evidence that this doesn't work. So there's an idea that it makes sense to study, human linguistic universals and typology without relation to the environment. And I'm going to be arguing in this paper that that's not enough, and there are lots of ways in which language is completely tied to the local environment. I'm going to argue that these points of view are not in conflict, just to clarify. So there have been similar discussions in folk biology, at least since the 1960s, in the work of Berlin and his colleagues. So no matter what language you speak, no matter where you live in the world, there's basically the same human naming system for living kinds. When I say living kinds, I mean plants, animals, and fungi, essentially. So all languages, as far as we know, have a term which we call a unique beginner term, a word for something like animal or plant. All languages have a word for basic life form, which is like bird, fish, mammal, tree, shrub. All languages have what's sometimes called a generic species, because in any particular environment, usually, not always, but usually, there's one example of a genus. So there'll be a particular species of that genus that will predominate in that local environment. So folk biologists often end up talking about a generic species. Words like goose, trout, fox, willow, honeysuckle. Then what happens is interesting. After these three layers, languages that get more specific go binomial. They use 2 nouns. And then if you get more specific again, you use 3 nouns. Right? So all of a sudden you're talking about a snow goose or a lesser snow goose or a rainbow trout or a coastal rainbow trout. And it's very interesting to me that basically every language that's been looked at, and there's been several hundred at least that I know of, all have some kind of system like this. So that speaks to shared cognitive architecture for human beings. Human beings tend to classify living kinds in the same way. And there's some references there. If it was true that human beings have an innate classification system, if you like, an innate ability to take interest in and classify living kinds, you'd expect this to come up in language acquisition as well, in the way people learn words. And this is what we find. Children have an innate, inborn enthusiasm for classifying living kinds. Children love birds, insects, animals. And in the first 25 words for English acquiring children, there's usually 5 for non-human animals, 5 for different types of humans, and 3 for words such as fruit, on average. Even kids in urban environments often seek out populations of creatures to identify with eagerness, determination, and precision. Anybody know what we're looking at here? Pokemon, right? When my son had his Pokemon phase, he could identify about 400 to 500 different Pokemon and classify them in 8 different families, right? That was after his dinosaur phase. Right? The history of Pokemon is quite fascinating, actually, because this guy who was raised in the Japanese countryside, and he used to go into the woods, and he used to collect insects and keep them in his house, and he used to go into the forest, and he would know the names of all the birds and all of the insects, and his family moved to Tokyo, and he felt really sorry for all of the kids in Tokyo, because they didn't know any of the names of all these insects and birds and creatures in the world, and he invented Pokemon, right? Which means pocket monster. Pocket monster is what it means. It comes from English. There's a fantastic paper by Bamford et al., which I think is from Nottingham or Birmingham. It's somewhere in the UK, where they tested children's knowledge of Pokemon versus things in the local environment, like how many trees can you name, or how many birds can you name. And it's kind of very sad that people do live surrounded by birds and trees, but in fact they can name far more dinosaurs or Pokemon. There are similarities in the order of acquisition, even comparing English-speaking children in the United States and Celtal-learning children in Mexico. So again, if this is some sort of universal classification system, not only would you expect to find echoes of it in patterns in language acquisition, but you'd also might be able to identify parts of the brain that serve this function. And this does appear to be the case. When people are diagnosed with herpes-induced encephalitis, they appear to lose the ability to name living kinds, specifically. So they can name computers and keyboards and cars and tires and compasses and projectors, but they have problems with dogs and cats and orchids and roses and dandelions, etc. So JBR was unable to name camels or buttercups while being able to describe flashlights and compasses. There are many examples. The case of L.A. here is really tragic because she was a biologist. Was a biologist. She couldn't be a biologist anymore. She had to stop what she was doing because she lost the ability to name living kinds. Another fascinating thing here is when you have this particular condition, which doesn't affect you cognitively in any other way, you lose the ability to distinguish between edible and inedible things. Because everything you eat was once alive. Everything you eat was once alive, right? So what happens is that people with this condition will drink shampoo, for example. In a hospital, they somehow can't. They lose this ability. There are cognitive effects, but this is common to everybody with this condition: the loss of the ability to name living things and the loss of the ability to distinguish between edible and inedible. People try to eat soap and things. So there does seem to be some evidence for universals, not only in human languages in general, with regard to syntax and phonology, but specifically in folk biological naming systems. So I'm not going to, the rest of this talk is going to switch to the opposite direction. I'm going to be arguing for cultural relativism. But I'm not arguing against this stuff, right? I just don't think it's in conflict. The fact that there are some universals doesn't mean that everything's universal. So how can I believe in this stuff that I've just presented and still believe that grammars can be shaped by culture and environment, as David Harrison pointed out? Well, let me give you an example. There are universal semantic features that play a role in every single human grammar that I know, like you decide whether something is plus or minus human, or plus or minus person, or plus or minus animate. But that doesn't tell you what the particular culture decides is plus or minus human, or plus or minus animate, or plus or minus person, right? If you have in English, personhood, for example, is reflected in the use of pronouns. If you have a cat or a dog at home, you probably refer to your cat as he or she rather than it, and you're bestowing personhood on that cat or on that dog by the use of your pronouns, right? Sometimes there's a choice. If you see a horse running across a field, you could say it, or you could say he or she. You can conceptualize it in different ways. A horse butcher might think about horses differently from a horse rider. So grammatical exponents in the world's languages, in this case, is not just through pronouns, but also through case marking, for example, of direct objects. In Hindi and in Spanish, you will case mark a direct object if it's both specific and animate, for example. In Diné or Navajo, they don't have SVO or SOV word order, like subject, verb, object, or etc. The word order in a sentence depends on where things sit in a cosmic chain of being. So everything in the world is basically in a hierarchy of sort of cosmic importance, as it were. So that the higher you are in the hierarchy, the more likely you are to come first in the sentence. So you can say the bear bit the cat, but you can't say the cat bit the bear. You have to say something like the cat bit it, or the bear was bitten by the cat. It's not actually a passive, but something like that. So there's animacy, or levels of animacy are revealed in this system. So humans are above bears, are above cats, are above ants, for example. Lightning is above humans. So there are many other examples of this. So in Ecuador, for example, Achuar hunters conceptualize toucans and howler monkeys as brothers-in-law. Achuar women talk to the plants in the village garden using a language of address that is specifically used for children. In Colombia, Macuna people believe that certain mammals and fish have their own longhouses, gardens, and ritual dances in which they appear in human form. This is actually very common throughout Amazonia, where other creatures are seen to... sometimes appear in human form and sometimes in animal form, and they will perceive humans sometimes in human form and sometimes in animal form as well. In Mali, Dogon healers consult kapok trees and other types of trees and have conversations with them in the forest. So society doesn't end at a boundary or a border with nature. You don't have culture and nature as two separate entities. A lot of different cultures in the world don't have this binary distinction between culture and nature. So therefore, this obviously affects syntax, it affects grammar, because what you define as human or animate or a relative, depends on the culture. So another thing that is very important, going back to the foxglove example, is that a word in one language never means the same as a word in another language, right? Ever. I mean, ever. I have a paper on this, which I called the gloss trap, because in linguistics, what you often do when you give an example from another language is you write the sentence in the original language, then you write a gloss, which is a word by word, or morpheme by morpheme, kind of literal translation. Then you translate the sentence more naturally into the other language. But it's a mistake to look at the gloss and think, aha, this morpheme means that morpheme, or this word means that word. It is a trap, because these things almost never mean the same thing. The past tense morpheme in one language doesn't mean the same as the past tense morpheme in another language, right? You would think, well, surely, if there's a word every language must have a word to be, or must have a word to have. And if you're a linguist, you know that that's really far from the truth. Actually, these, Hmong has 6 different words for to be, depending if it's to be in a location, to be in time, to be in terms of identity, etc. You might think, well, surely modern inventions, but German has at least 2 words for television. One for the abstract concept of television, like I work in television, versus the television apparatus, which might be in your room. That's because the meaning of a word in any language is related to other words in the same system, and this idea goes back to Saussure. The word sheep can't mean the same as the word, in English, can't mean the same as the word sheep in French, because we also have a word mutton. So the meat of the sheep is called mutton, but in French they're both called mouton. That means they don't mean the same thing, right? So if you think of the word chair, for example, I mean, most people have wherever you are in the world, have some sort of concept for chair, but what exactly you mean by chair depends on whether you have other words in your language for beanbag, bench, pew, seat, sofa, stool, because the existence of these other words kind of denotates or circumscribes, in fact, the meaning of the word that you're talking about. Let's take the word drink, right? All human beings drink, right? So you might think, well, there must be a universal word for to drink, but this is just not true. In English, you drink liquids. In Turkish, you can drink liquids or gases, right? So you can drink a cigarette. And this is a common error when Turkish people learn English. They'll say, can I drink it? Just going to drink a cigarette now. In Kazakh, you can drink both liquids and solids in contexts where English would require, eat. In Diné again, they have 15 different words of consumption. The word you use will depend on whether what you're eating or drinking is hard, mushy, leafy, liquid. I love this one, solid but dunked in liquid. So if you have a digestive biscuit and you dip it in your tea, there's a special word for that manner of consumption in Navajo. And it's not just the general meanings of words, it's the grammatical information that words carry, right? If you use a particular verb, it will have information about tense or aspect or how many people it's referring to. If you use a noun, it might refer to whether it's a count noun or a mass noun. So for those of you who might not be linguists, count nouns and mass nouns is a huge distinction in English. So you say a few books or many books, but you say, little water or much water. It goes kind of throughout the grammar. You say there is a book on the table, but there's some water, you know, it goes throughout the grammar. But what counts as count or mass can vary from language to language. So grapes, for example, are a count noun in English. You say, do you have any grapes? Yes, I have some grapes. Could I have a grape? You can have 3. Whereas in French, grapes are a mass noun. The word for French is, grape in French is raisin, which is spelled raisin. It's easy to remember, so you think, aha, raisin. I remember that means grape. Now I've learned French. No, you haven't. Because in French you would say, do you have any grape? Yes, I have some grape. Could I have a grain of grape? You can have 3 grains of grape. So in other words, and if I put these pictures so you can see the way they talk about grapes is the same way as we talk about rice. That's because it's not really a count or an aggregate, a count or mass. It's an aggregate, right? It's a bunch of small things together. Anyway, so why is this relevant to studying, traditional ecological knowledge in endangered cultures? That's because when biologists and conservationists go into areas of the world where they're trying to document and revitalize traditional ecological knowledge, it's really important to understand that the naming systems that people have for living kinds in their own ecosystem will never map directly onto English, ever. So traditionally, people used to come up with glossaries where you have, in language A is a list of terms for like trees, and language B is a list of terms. This means this, but it never does. Again, think back to the foxglove example. So naming systems can be extremely revealing of whether the plant, for example, is edible or toxic or medicinal or used for shelter or clothing, or whether the plant is related to other things in the same ecosystem, whether this plant will tell you when this migrating bird is going to arrive or something like this. And all of that is lost if you just assume that one word means the same as another word in 2 different languages. So it's important to note that language diversity is geographically correlated with biological diversity. The zones of the planet that have the most languages also have the most species. And this is also linked to endangerment, because the parts of the world that have the highest concentration of endangered languages also have the highest threats to biodiversity. So when ethnobiologists conduct research in some of these areas, it's invaluable to have an understanding of the traditional ecological knowledge that's linguistically encoded by these communities. Here's a map that I find super useful. Every black dot is a human language. There are 7,000 black dots on this map. The depth of green on the map refers to biodiversity as measured by vascular plants, because vascular plants are a very good stand-in in most parts of the world for biodiversity elsewhere in the system. And you'll see that some parts of the world have a tremendous amount of linguistic diversity and a tremendous amount of biological diversity. You'll notice some correlations. This happens in islands for the same reason as Charles Darwin noted his finches becoming different species in the Galapagos. Languages become different languages in island chains for similar reasons. You'll notice that there's a tendency also towards the equator, because both people and other animals, other plants also, well, not plants, but people and other animals don't have to seasonally migrate as much, where you don't have such huge swings in temperature. Areas with big high rainfall, high fertility. Islands are similar to mountains. If you live in a mountainous area, it takes a long time to travel from one place to another. So you'll notice that the Himalayas appear on this map purely in terms of how many languages are spoken there. Those black dots represent the Himalayas. You see the Andes are similar. The mountains of Mexico are similar. Papua New Guinea is entirely obscured by languages here. Okay, as you might think, well, surely even if you change languages, if you move from sort of Kayapo in the Xingu Basin in Brazil to Portuguese, maybe you can just take your knowledge with you and just re-encode that knowledge in Portuguese. But that's not what happens. When people change languages, they lose the knowledge. And this has been documented around the world, right? So in Venezuela, Joti children living in a traditional forest habitat have names for about 220 edible plants, 180 different medicinal plants. But those who have shifted into the mission villages, into the schooling system, have a dramatic and tremendous loss of this kind of knowledge. It's been documented. In Papua New Guinea, there was a recent study involving more than 6,000 high school students, and their knowledge of birds, right? This study included 392 different languages. Their knowledge of birds immediately drops. And of course, it's not just because of moving from one language to another. That's symptomatic of moving from one environment to another, right? If you're put in a school system and all of a sudden your education is within 4 walls in a city, this knowledge is lost. So there have been many examples of positive reclamation around the world where people have moved away from the simple glossary technique of just recording species, and they think about language education and environmental education as one and the same thing. So you have to take the kids outside of the classroom and you move them into the countryside, into the mountains, into the bush. You learn language, what the Australians say, on country. So the Kimberley Language Research Centre in Australia is a good example of that. They get kids to video themselves, exploring, learning how to use different plants. Here's a picture of people in that project. In Colombia, there's a great example of scientists, mostly from the United States, working together with indigenous people, doing a joint project to reclaim sacred sites of the, some people might know about the Kogi people of the lost city, La Ciudad Perdida de Santa Marta in Colombia. It's about 50 miles from the Caribbean coast, but they have glaciers because the mountains rise to 5,000 meters, just 50 miles from the coast. But the Colombian government have just created a new reserve, giving their territory back to them, which was stolen by the Spanish. So now people are documenting in both languages. They have teams of Kogi priests working together with American biologists to document the ecosystem. Because they carry, for example, even to chew coca leaves, they mix it with a kind of lime they get from seashells. They collect the seashells and bring them up to the mountain and give gifts to the mountains from the sea. And there are other examples as well. Hidayati et al. In Indonesia, Rapinski et al. In Nunavik. There are lots of examples now of this more enlightened approach to treating language seriously when it comes to biological conservation, biodiversity conservation. Okay, so there is a paradigm shift underway because language contributes to what Mika refers to in his discussion of Tereo Maori as the worlding of things through language. I like this phrase. This applies also to dictionaries. When you write new dictionaries, it's not just A equals B, but the best new dictionaries of indigenous languages are more like encyclopedic dictionaries, where you have information not only about what it might translate as, but what you do with a certain thing. The bloodwood gall grows on the bloodwood tree. We pick them and then split them open. They have a little grub inside, a nice tasting one. We used to eat it, right? That's part of the definition of what it means to know this word. And I'll skip over that. So moving on to this last part of the talk, really. If I'm arguing that, in fact, culture and environment do matter, that there is a sense of linguistic relativity that is important, in addition to whatever linguistic universals we might find, how can we find, what are the different ways in which there can be a cultural classification of living kinds? So one aspect of this I'd like to look at first is linguistic encoding of ecological and utilitarian knowledge. So for example, this is one of my favorite examples. Darrell Posey, who passed away a few years ago, did lots of fantastic work with the Kayapo people in the Xingu Basin in Brazil. And one of the things he found is that they had a really impressive knowledge of bees. These people really like bees. So they have 56 names for different types of bees, grouped into 15 families. And at the time, this was beyond the Western taxonomy of bees in that region. But what's really interesting is you look at what the names mean. So some of the names will tell you about the flight pattern of this particular species of bee, or its aggression, or its sound in flight, the places it typically visits. In other words, the behavioral characteristics. Other names could describe the nest geometry or the ecological niche, whether you find them in the flood forest or in the savanna. The names of bees can refer to the physical characteristics, the shape, color, smell, markings, etc., or the use to humans, the quality of the honey, the quantity of the honey, the quality of the resin, the quality of the wax, the edibility of pollen or larvae. If this seems really complicated, it really isn't. When I first arrived in Indiana, my wife and I had to remodel and kind of rebuild the house we bought. So I built a wooden deck at the front of the house, the entranceway to the house. So I was very happy and proud. I had this new wooden deck leading up to the front door. And then one day I see a little bee making a hole in my deck, drilling a hole in my deck, just one bee, and I was looking inside the hole, the bee pops out and goes back in the hole, and I go, what's this? So I said to my neighbors, well, what's this? Do you know what that is? That's because you're not from the Midwest. A carpenter bee, yes. So everybody knows that this is called a carpenter bee. In fact, carpenter bee is the folk name. Biologists will tell you there are more than one species, but who cares, right? Yeah. Carpenter bees do that, and we call them all carpenter bees because all of the species that we call carpenter bees are bees that, guess what, drill holes in wood, right? And it's useful. So is it easy to remember a name like carpenter bee? You bet it is, right? I will never forget that this kind of bee that drills holes in wood is called a carpenter bee. So you have to understand that when this looks sophisticated, that's because we're looking from the outside. Inside the language, these are just everyday words for types of bees, right? It's really easy. And again, just to lighten this up, these bees can be very beautiful and also very different from each other. They can be easy to distinguish. Some of my favorites are the orchid bees, which are, so iridescent and beautiful. So it's not that all the bees look exactly the same and these people are just super perspicacious. The bees actually do look quite different. And there are other examples throughout the world. Reindeer naming in Todzu, Siberia, yak naming in Tofa, or Tuvan as well. Wherever you go, when people live very closely with other animals, they will develop very complex naming systems. Now, some people like David Harrison have argued that this is somehow part of the genius of specific languages, but I would argue that it isn't. This is just part of the human naming faculty. So if you work with horses, then you're going to come up with a similar naming system to Tuvan nomads naming their yaks, for example. Foal, weanling, yearling, colt, filly, mare, gelding, stallion. These are also very, very specific words. I don't know if anybody's familiar with a book called H is for Hawk. Ever read that book? H is for Hawk. I can't remember the name of Helen MacDonald is a British author. This is a fantastic book, which is partly about her coming to terms with grief because her dad had just died, but she throws herself into the world of falconry, and it's a book about falconry, and you think, well, why would those things have anything to do with each other, and why would it be interesting? But it's actually one of the most lyrical books of creative nonfiction you'll ever read. And one thing that surprises me is just how many words there are in English for hawks and falcons. Because as she points out, in Shakespearean London, it was more common to see somebody walking down the street with a hawk on their glove than it was to see somebody walking a dog. Yeah. So I don't think this is the genius of particular languages. It's part of the human ability to name living kinds. However, that's saying that this is a universal capability doesn't knock the cultural relativity, because what matters is not whether you can do it, but whether you actually do it. If you lose the ability to name things in your environment, then you've lost knowledge about where you live. If you can no longer name those trees, then how do you know what they're good for, right? So in fact, these naming systems are incredibly valuable, and particular to, each culture living in a particular ecosystem. So it's not a question of whether human beings can do it, it's whether they do. And if a culture has this kind of knowledge, can they pass it on to new generations? So grammatical morphemes, just in case some people here are not linguists, these are examples of morphemes in English, the ed in played, the ing in playing, things like at or some. These would be grammatical morphemes in English, just to go by example. This sort of thing turns up in other languages in really amazingly specific ways in terms of the encoding of ecological knowledge. So in some languages, for example, rather than, we have words, if I say, for example, in English, I think it's easier to explain by example. If I say there is a turkey on the table, this is different from there is some turkey on the table, right? There is a turkey on the table refers to a bounded entity, an object. It could be alive. I could have a live turkey on my table, or it could have just come out of the oven, right? But it's an object. We conceptualize it as a bounded entity. If I say there is some turkey on the table, that refers to it as a substance, right? It could actually look the same as the turkey I pulled out of the oven home. If I say some turkey, I'm thinking of the same thing as a substance rather than an object. Or I could cut it up and say some turkey, in which case I can't say a turkey really anymore. But this is a really simple way of classifying objects in the world. So in some languages like Piaroa, there's a similar sort of system, but instead of words like at and some, they have 125 different morphemes that classify things in different ways, whether they're cylindrical, round, flat, whether they're human or animal. But they have about 75 different classifiers for different types of botanical or ecological kinds of information, whether something is a type of thin, free-flowing sap, or a type of rosette-shaped herbaceous plant, etc. So sometimes, again, remember that the general argumentation here is that, yes, there are universals, but these cultural particulars are just as, or perhaps even more important, actually, when it comes to issues of conservation. The kind of ecological knowledge that is encoded in a language like Piaroa is mind-blowing. Here are some examples of these. They go on and on and on, of different classifiers. They live in a part of Venezuela which is characterized by these high mountains that come off the forest floor, called tepuis. If you've seen the Disney film Up, it's that kind of landscape. Arthur Conan Doyle thought dinosaurs might still live there. But what's even cooler is that there are plants on the top of these tepuis whose closest relatives are not on the forest floor, but in Africa. Because there was a time when South America was joined to Africa, and as they split apart, there are descendants of plants that still live on the top there, whose closest relatives are in West Africa. So it is an amazing, amazing landscape. And this sort of classification comes out in classifiers as well. Some of you might be familiar with classifier systems that, like in Japanese or Chinese, that are using counting systems, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, will be different numbers if you're counting flat things or round things, etc. But sometimes these counting systems, or the classifier systems, also encode ecological knowledge. So, for example, in Minangkabau in Indonesia, in Sumatra, numerical classifiers are used to differentiate seed-like objects, flowers, leaves with stalks, or clumps of plants, for example. In Baniwa, in northwest Amazonia, it has a special classifier just for different types of excrement, just for different types of poo, because that's really important in hunting. Linguistically encoded information can also relate to seasons. I'll skip over this because I talked about it yesterday. But the name, if you look around different North American languages, for example, the name for April will reflect what you do in that part of the country at that time of year. And also, as I discussed yesterday, ecological knowledge is encoded not only in the mental lexicon in words, but also in songs, rituals, prayers, which children learn, which are part of festivals that you celebrate every year, so that you know that when the dark-billed cuckoo sings, for the Wayampi people in northern Brazil, the cuckoo will start singing at the beginning of the dry season, when the Pleiades constellation can be seen in the morning sky, and it will continue singing until the Pleiades can be seen in the evening sky. And during this time, it drinks fermented maniac, and it gets really drunk, and it drunkenly sings all through the season. When it stops singing, that's when you know that the sweet potatoes are beginning to sprout. So the language in the form of this song is actually telling new generations about the connection between this bird, this constellation, and the food source. Another important thing to realize when you talk about how ecological knowledge can be encoded in languages is that you don't only have one system of classifying things. No language has only one system of classifying things. So when Berlin and his colleagues said, okay, all languages have the same system of classification, there's always a name for a unique beginner, there's always a name for a generic species, what he was doing is he was looking at names based on the visual system and on morphology. But you don't always classify things based on what they look like. So for example, when Stephen Feld did his work in Papua New Guinea, his colleague, his indigenous colleague who he was working with, got frustrated with him. And he said, listen, to you, they're birds. But to me, there are voices in the forest. And he went, oh, okay. Because actually, if you're living in the rainforest, you hear the birds more often than you see them. You always hear the birds before you see them. But also, the voices have two dimensions. There is the physical dimension, but there's also the spiritual dimension, because when people die, their souls go into birds. So there's certain species of birds where you can communicate with your ancestors by listening to the bird. So the voices are much more important. And in fact, what they really care about in this culture is not the system that matches the universal system, but what they really care about is the groupings of birds that say their names, that make a lot of noise, that only sound, that speak the Bosavi language, that whistle, that weep, and that sing funeral songs. Again, just to split this up, the birds of Papua New Guinea are quite amazing. So they have this huge, these are all types of birds of paradise in this picture. So they really do care about naming their birds. Birds are a huge part of their cultural lives. But it's a mistake to think that they think about birds, classify birds, conceptualize birds in the same way. Right? The universalist approach just falls on its face as soon as you take a serious look at how people name and talk about these birds. And this works in English too. Like if you have a kid in this country, you'll probably get library books for your kid, and the library books will divide animals into types, like sea creatures. So fish will be classified with octopus, right? Or farm animals, pig will be classified with chicken, right? Because we can think easily in terms of classifications which are in parallel to biological classification. Crops. Crop is folk biology. Weed is folk biology. If something's a weed, that's a value judgment. Yeah. So in my garden, I let the violets grow because I like violets, but my neighbor thinks they're weeds. So it's actually a folk classification. Flowers is a folk classification. These are not scientific classifications at all. So every language is the same. Like, do you consider this plantable, beautiful, or useless? Right? That will give you your classification. And it's the same in food practices. We are not abandoning our folk biology in English just because we took a biology class in school, right? If you go to the supermarket, you might have been told in school, oh, tomato is a fruit, not a vegetable. Well, good luck finding it between the apples and the bananas, right? And similarly, and if you're going to get all on a high horse about tomatoes, consider that strawberries are not berries. Raspberries are not berries, according to botanists, but who cares, right? Because our folk biological classifications matter to us. If I'm going to have some berries with ice cream, I'm not going to follow the biologists and use chili peppers or watermelons, right? Because these are botanically, these are considered berries. So folk biology is everywhere and it matters, and it's also culturally relative. And folk biology can provide windows into how people see things, how people use things. So, for example, you might be surprised that this is one family of birds. You know, toucan, 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 falcon, right? Yeah. What is this raptor doing in there with a bunch of toucans? But for Wayampi people, this is a single bird family. Yeah. So Western biologists were very surprised by this, and they said, well, what on earth is going on? But it turns out that this is that most unusual of things. It's a vegetarian falcon, right? Yeah. Not only that, it's a frugivore. It only eats fruit. Not only that, it eats exactly the same fruit as the rest of these toucans, right? So they had an insight into the behavior of this bird that Western science had missed. There's also fluidity within naming systems. Within a particular naming system, names can flip and change depending on certain things. You can conceptualize things in different ways, but there can also be taboos. So you're not allowed to use a name for something in certain contexts, and then there'll be an alternative naming systems. So this is just another example of how you can have parallel naming systems in the same language. Like if a person is named after a tree, but the person dies in Northern Australia, you're not allowed to use the name of that tree for several years. You have to use an alternative name because the name is taboo. But it's important to realize that we have this fluidity in naming also in English. So, for example, when we say animal, that can mean all sorts of different things. So if you say people and animals, right, you're dividing humans versus non-human animals. If you say in the forest, there are lots of animals and birds. And there you mean animals means mammals. If you say plant, if you say, I don't want a tree, I just want some plants. Plant can include tree or not. So we have this sort of fluidity in human language. And it's not just specific to these languages I've been talking about. I'm going to move on from that, just because we're running out of time a little bit. So classification can be modulated by belief systems and taboo systems as well. Also, it's important, again, when we talk about cultural relativism and sort of the encoding of ecological knowledge in language, animacy turns out to be really important for notions of environmental personhood. So without going into this in detail, I'm sure many of you know that there's been legislation in environmental personhood granting juristic rights, granting legal rights to rivers, forests, mountains in several countries in the world. This first actually started, surprisingly, in a very small county in Pennsylvania, and they argued successfully that the river was a person. And on the basis of that legal case, the government of Ecuador changed their constitution, and then soon Bolivia, and then New Zealand carried it on, granting rights to rivers and forests. And now you have these cases in the United States, in India, in Canada. But it's important to realize that this is reflected in languages. So this is a person, which is a forest, which has been granted personhood in New Zealand. But in New Zealand, if you belong to a particular iwi, a particular tribe, then you will have a particular revered ancestor, a particular ancestral canoe. You will have a particular river and a particular mountain associated with your tribe. But you don't say, what is your mountain? Right? You say literally, who is your mountain? Right? So it's very interesting that there are linguistic reflections of environmental personhood in many languages where a feature of the landscape is considered to be what De la Cadena has called an earth being, right? So for example, in Spanish, in northern Peru, in the Moche area, there are spirits in mountains and in burial mounds. but they would take a personal "a" before the direct object, right? If I'm going to this, I saw the mountain yesterday, you would have a personal "a" to show that the mountain has personhood. For a waka, or apu in Peru. So these cases are playing out in India, in New Zealand, in Canada. This is the Magpie River. So in conclusion, coming back to this issue of universalism versus relativism in language and biology, in linguistics, we have two halves of the field, each working semi-independently while disparaging the other. So universalists tend to hate cultural relativists and vice versa. If you want examples of this, read Steven Pinker or John McWhirter, who will tell you that cultural relativism is a complete waste of time and these people don't understand anything. If you want relativity, you look at people like Guy Deutscher or Nicholas Evans, and they'll tell you that Chomsky linguistics is a total waste of time, little more than intellectual moonshine. I think both these halves of the field are utterly wrong. You have different research programs because people ask different research questions. I think it's legitimate to ask, what makes us human? What do we all have in common? What cognitive universals might we have? That's a legitimate question. But the idea that that could explain everything is also absurd, because actually I find that the parts of language, the parts of linguistics that are most relevant for biocultural diversity conservation are the parts that exhibit cultural relativity, right? Where language is tied to particular ecosystems. It's interesting that in ethnobiology, I think they provide a model for us linguists. Because similarly, there was a very impassioned history of debate between universalists and relativists, but the opposition between these two halves of the field didn't split the field. And it's resulted in a kind of productive tension. And I like this term, which was suggested in a review of one of my articles that was initially rejected by the reviewer. But I got it published in the end. But the reviewer was helpful to me in saying that this is, in ethnobiology it's different. It's a kind of productive tension, and I like this idea. It's shifted into the background of current research. People acknowledge that it's there, but it doesn't stop them sort of being friends and talking to each other and swapping notes. But in ethnobiology, though, there's still a need, I think, to fully recognize the positive potential of linguistics to shed light on the cultural classification of living kinds. I'm going to skip to the end here, just to say at the end that any sharing of indigenous ecological knowledge in conservation efforts must be made with an understanding of and respect for lexical relativity, the idea that the meanings of words are actually endemic to the language in which they're ensconced. So the basic problem, I think, is binary thinking, actually. Binary ways of thinking that I think have cursed Europe for the last 500 years at least. So dichotomous thinking is fundamental to the Western ecological tradition, and I think it's something we need to escape from. So universality versus relativity, science versus indigenous beliefs, academics versus informants. I think these are all kind of unhelpful dichotomies in a way. And I think this whole sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis type way of thinking has to be rigorously challenged if we want to seriously decolonize the academy. And that's the end of my talk for today. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
That was absolutely fantastic. I've got